Half the new AIDS cases now come from injection drug use. We could cut that rate in half easily if we fund a needle exchange, but we won't fund needle exchange, and so that keeps on running rampant. And in fact, when you look at AIDS among babies, 90% of those cases have this starting point as a dirty needle. And so even among kids, babies born, it's injection drug use. Look at the international scene. We're now getting involved in a war in Colombia, a 4-decade-old civil war. And in a civil war where both sides, the right and the left, have been involved in drug trafficking. We're picking one side or the other. We like the right-wing drug traffickers better than left-wing drug traffickers. And so we're getting engaged in that civil war. So you can look at almost any issue. It's like the Kevin Bacon game, you know, where you have, how many steps away from Kevin Bacon is this actor? I kind of play the drug policy game. How many steps away from the drug war is this U.S. problem? Because almost every significant problem that we're facing in the country today has a complicating factor caused by the drug war.
Well, I mean, going back to, say, the issue of racism, though, I mean, given the obvious race issues involved, why is it that the Black Caucus and other major forces are not...
Well, actually, the Black Caucus has made some changes. I mean, in the mid-'80s, when the crack epidemic was hitting, the Black Caucus got caught up in the fear of crack. And as a result, they were part of the institution of mandatory sentencing, the institution of heavy crack penalties, the institution of sentencing guidelines that is a large part why the United States is approaching 2 million people in prison. 1/4 of the world's prison population is in the United States. And the Black Caucus at that time supported that because they saw the community being hurt by crack. But I think in the last few years, the Black Caucus has totally changed. And in fact, just 2 years ago, Maxine Waters, the chair of the Black Caucus, called for General McCaffrey's resignation over the issue of not funding needle exchange.
Well, she may have called for General McCaffrey's resignation, but General McCaffrey hasn't resigned, and in fact the prison industrial complex, I would say, is probably growing just as it has.
No question about it. We're dealing with some very tough social forces. But my point was that the Black Caucus has come around, it's gotten involved in the mandatory sentencing debate, it's gotten involved in the driving while black debate, the needle exchange debate. Black leadership is changing. You know, when Jesse Jackson first ran for president, one of his slogans was "Smoke a joint, go to the joint." And now, in the last couple of years, he's been extremely critical of the prison industrial complex and the incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders. So he's gone through a big metamorphosis. I think the black community recognizes now that they were hoodwinked in the mid-'80s. And that they became an instrument of the power players in Congress, and their community was hurt more than any other community. You can look at any aspect of the drug policy: arrests, prosecutions, incarceration. Blacks and Hispanics are unfairly represented. Look at AIDS. You know, you take a white heroin user and a black heroin user. The black is 5 times as likely to get AIDS. Why? Because law enforcement is focused on the black community, therefore possessing a needle is more risky, therefore they're not going to hold on to needles and they're going to share, so that's 5 times more likely to get AIDS. You look at any aspect of the drug war, you'll see a very strong racially disproportionate effect. Among Latin Americans, for example, Hispanics, in the federal prison system, 60% of the people in prison for marijuana and for heroin are Hispanic. 60%. They're nowhere near that percent of our population. But because the way law enforcement is focused, they're being unfairly prosecuted. So racism, and racism, as you know, has been a historical problem in the drug war. You go back to the first anti-drug laws, and they were in San Francisco at the turn of the century. They were directed specifically at Chinese Americans and their opium dens. Not just opium dens generally, but Chinese opium dens. Those were the first anti-drug laws in this country. You look at the 1920s, when alcohol was made illegal. That was an attack at Italians and on Irish. They were the immigrants of those days. You look at the marijuana, cocaine, and heroin laws, and you consistently see arguments about, you know, a black or a Mexican getting high and raping a white woman. And that was always the scare that was produced in advance of any of those substances becoming illegal. And so racism has always been a part of the drug war, and I think in the last 10 years, it's awfully hard to look at the impact of the drug war and say it's not having a racially unfair effect. And because our legislators don't do anything to correct that, it's awful hard not to call them racists. because they know it's having an unfair racial effect. They've been told, and they keep on supporting these laws. So it's awfully hard to say they're not racists.
I don't know how much they would like to hear that.
Well, I mean, reality is reality. I'm not saying anything. I'm not trying to be overstating the case. I mean, I really think that the evidence is now so strong of the unfair. I mean, 1 out of 2 young black men in urban areas under police supervision or in jail. How can you have a family develop? How can a community have its economy develop? How can anything positive occur with the kids in those communities when the fathers are in jail? It just can't happen. And then, of course, the racists, the open racists, the David Dukes in our society will point to the black community and say, where are the fathers? How come they're not working? How come they're not taking care of the kids? Well, the reason they're not is because they're not allowed to. The drug laws have pushed the parents away from the kids. And these are things that really shouldn't even be illegal. And that's the bottom line, is we've taken a wrong-headed approach, a prohibition approach, and it just doesn't work. And we keep on, rather than accepting the reality, we keep on expanding the mistake. The only way that prohibition can go, if you continue it, is to become more violent, more militaristic, escalate, because if it begins to de-escalate...
Well, there are those who are proponents of that.
No question about it. No question about it. And the reality is it will never work. And in fact, what we're really in a situation of is, the classic example of someone trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. And they're pushing that round peg into the square hole. It's not going to fit. They keep pushing, keep pushing, keep pushing. Rather than learning to pick up a square peg and put that in, they keep pushing the round peg. And I call it a round peg and square hole because drug problems at their root are health problems with social consequences. They're not law enforcement problems. And yet we take that round peg of law enforcement and say we're going to solve this with brute force, rather than saying we recognize this as a health problem and solve it with public health approaches. Once you make that acceptance that drug abuse is a health problem, and primarily a health problem, not a law enforcement problem, then you begin to have sensible policies. For example, if you accepted the premise that drug prohibition, that drug problems are health problems, then you would make treatment on request a reality. That would be your first priority. Right now, I just was at a meeting at the White House the other day. The Surgeon General said 85% of people who need treatment on any given day don't get it. 85% don't get it. That means you have people who want to stop using drugs and aren't given any help to do it. And so what does that mean? It means 6 months of waiting. It means 6 months of drug use. It means 6 months of supporting the black market in drugs and helping the gangs and the cartels get rich. It means 6 months of robbing and stealing to pay for those drugs. And so we create this negative effect. But we recognize that this is a health problem and make treatment available on request. Once someone wants to stop, they can stop. If you recognize it's a health problem as well, then you make methadone available to heroin addicts by doctors. Not to go to some methadone clinic and congregate with all the heroin addicts in town to swap stories on where the best heroin is. No, you go to your private doctor, you get a prescription, you go to the pharmacy, you fill it. That's what has been recommended by all the leading health agencies in the United States, and yet we're not doing it.
Isn't that the way it is in England?
It's the way it is in a number of European cities, in Australia. I mean, and as I said, the Institute of Medicine, and the National Institute of Health, the two gold standards of American medicine, have recommended patients getting their prescription from doctors and fulfilling it at a pharmacy. It makes so much more sense. I mean, rather than having a not in my backyard problem where all the drug addicts come to a clinic, you have it dispersed, more easily handleable, and you do more by making, if you do those two things, making method available by prescription and treatment on request, you do those two things, you would undermine the cartels dramatically. You would undermine the gangs dramatically. And those are just two obvious steps. I mean, there are others. I mean, there's so many obvious steps that you could take.
And in regards to the gangs, I've heard it said that a lot of the violence associated with gangs is a result of drug prohibition.
No question about it. If you look at the crime related to drugs, particularly the violent crime, what you see is that it's not drug intoxication that's causing the violence, it's drug trade that's causing the violence. In other words, people fighting over who controls that retail outlet, who controls that street corner. It's just like Chicago during alcohol prohibition, the murder capital of the world. When alcohol prohibition ended, we had the largest drop in our history as far as homicides go.